to be speaking in front of you. I hope you can hear me properly. Nitish, can you please tell me if the sound is functioning, is fine?
Initially, it was breaking a bit. Now it's fine. The latter part of the sentence is fine. Initially, it was breaking.
Okay, hopefully it will all go through.
It's fine now.
So, turbulent stating, why such a name? Because the relationships between Germany and Iran were not easy. There were ups and downs. And here is the outline of the talk. We will first talk a little bit about the history of these relations. Then we're going to move towards the issue of WMD, which stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction, non-proliferation. And then Artem will talk about the German role in formation of the foreign policy of the EU, and we will conclude. So first of all, let me say you this thing. For example, why we all know that there is a huge tension between Iran and the United States. And part of this problem stems from different mentalities. Of course, mentalities, national characters, they always matter. So, for example, Iranians, they are more rooted in literature. And literature by nature is a kind of promotes a kind of a sober outlook towards life, whereas Americans are more people kind of treat the as fixed. And Iranians always remember very well and very painfully remember what happened in the past. And they always think of this in the current relationships. So, of course, the relationship does not move on, does not develop in any sense. Germany, in this regard, was in a more fortunate position because never anything of that sort happened between Germany and Iran. Germany was never a colonial power, and hence it never hurt the national pride of Persians, Iranians. And as follows from this quote, Germany has had more of a cultural and economic impact on Iran than any other foreign country. This is a strong statement, isn't it? Actually, we're going to cover just a little bit the ancient, not relatively ancient history of these two relationships. So, of course, we had Prussia before the reunification, and Bismarck was more of a person who was centered on the continent. He was not very much interested in going global. However, when Wilhelm II Kaiser came to power, Bismarck was kicked out, so to say, fell out of favor. He had a new vision. He had a sort of a Weltpolitik, meaning he was interested in expanding and establishing relationships with some other states outside of Europe. And he had a called Orientreise. He took a trip around the Middle East. He's been to Palestine, to Israel, to Damascus, in today's Syria, and he also visited Persia. And what we have done, they were the first ones to make contacts with Germany because they needed loans from the German state. They wanted to get some money to, build some plants and infrastructure. But initially, Prussia was reluctant. However, in the 1920s, Germany became the state on which the Pahlavi dynasty relied heavily to industrialize Iran. So you see, for example, in the left bottom corner, Juncker. This was the German company that received a monopoly on passenger flights in Iran. Can you imagine? A foreign company that was allowed to basically fly passenger airlines all around. And in the First World War, of course, because relationships between the states were quite good, you had some Germans working inside Iran against the Brits. So you see this person on the portrait on the book, Wasmus, the so-called Deutsche Lawrence, German Lawrence. He was the one who was instigating riots against the Brits in the south of Iran. And on the right, again, bottom, you see National Bank. Top economic advisors in Iran were coming from Germany. They were invited by the Shah. Later, in the Nazi period, when the Third Reich arose, Nazis initially were not interested again in anything besides just, expanding their industrial base. to both Iran and Afghanistan to strengthen economic ties, because these were two states where the British Empire were not as strong. So what we have to understand about Iran is that this country was always a battleground for colonial powers. So you had on the one hand you had Russia, on the other hand you had British Empire, and they struggled for influence and for oil. You see, because Iran, we all know, is an oil-rich country. In the left bottom corner, you see a picture, a photo that was taken 1953. This was a coup d'etat, which was assisted, among other states, by the United States. So before that, actually, the United States were also seen in Iran as a third country. So a country that can be relied upon, that can be regarded as a friendly non-colonial power. However, after that, things changed, because virtually this was the only attempt to democratize a state in the region. And it was prevented by the United States. Of course, you can imagine what kind of relationships could follow. But then in 1943, Iran was forced to declare war against Germany under the both Soviet and British pressure. But already at that time, the trade between Nazi Germany and Iran far exceeded the trade, for example, between Soviet Union and Iran, because it was like a plot by the Germans. They were engaging in some negotiations with British, for example, but it did not leave such a stain on their reputation in the eyes of Iranians. So they were still seen as a good power. Now one may ask, Iranian regime, for a long time was not very democratic. There were always human victims because there was no democracy, never. It were a democracy mostly. It was a centralized state that relied on raw materials and on connections with the elites of the colonial powers. How come they still had this good relationship? Basically because they were always tied very strongly economically. So you see, for example, in 1968, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, he came to Berlin, and there were student protests. There were people, if you saw the cover photo of our event, these were the slogans: stop tortures of political prisoners. We don't want our country to be in a good relationship with such a regime. And even in 1976, Amnesty International was not allowed to hold a human rights conference. But then, 1907 revolution, it changed quite a lot. But still, Germany stood alone. It did not give into the pressure of the United States, and it was the only country that continued to have good relationships with Iran. Can you imagine? You can say that this was just a pragmatic interest, but in the long term, perhaps, Germany now has more leverage on Iran than the United States, and more trust between these countries. Another reason behind that was because Germany was neutral in the Iran-Iraqi war. You probably know that Iraqis, they used chemical weapons against Iran. And this is one of the points of what Iran accuses the West: hypocrisy. Okay, so Iraqis, they have chemical weapons. You know about that. You don't do anything. And then you don't impose any sanctions on Iraq because of that. But we in Iran, we are your enemies. So of course, Iranians were not very happy about that. But, of course, no connections with the US. The diplomatic ties were broken, also because the American staff at the embassy were taken hostage for a long time, 444 days. It was quite a disaster, quite a diplomatic event. But between Germany and Iran, there were visits of foreign ministers. The trade was flowing quite well. And so what you have to understand, what is the difference between the American approach and the German approach? You can say that the Americans, of course, they were offended because it goes against all rules of diplomacy to break into the embassy, to take hostages, but also because Iran, for the US, it was like a stronghold against. In Iran, of course, there were socialist movements. There were people who supported the kind of turning, maybe following a socialist path, just like the USSR did. And but Germans, they were in a different position, and especially after the Second World War, for them the distinctions between politics and economics and between domestic and foreign policy became more fluid. Again, let us ask this question: is it ethical? Can you really trade with a regime that is so bad in human rights? Actually, the German foreign minister Hans-Dieter Genscher in the 1980s, he sought to improve West-Iranian relations. So he was like a mediator. But he suggested that Iran has to democratize, has to perform better in terms of human rights and release all hostages, and then maybe we are going to have good relationships. But so, for example, there was this affair of Salman Rushdie, who is a famous writer. He wrote this book, The Satanic Verses. It was not an anti-Islamic book, but it was, called this way by Ayatollah Khomeini, the new leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And what's more, actually, people were promised some gain for finding this person, for killing this person. And this was not the end, because in 1992, there was an actual murder in Berlin of Kurdish dissidents. Iranian Kurds were, and further on, it was proven in 1997 that this murder was basically authorized by the Iranian government officials. Before that, in 1992, there was a summit in Edinburgh that announced the policy of critical dialogue towards Iran. But of course, after the court proved that this murder was authorized, it's just a regular, human act to withdraw your ambassadors, to say we are not going to have any sort of politics with the regime like this that does these things. And even in 1992, so you see, what were the objectives? It's not the same as with the United States. We talk, we have a critical dialogue, we try to engage constructively. But of course, we would like to see a Middle East process moving forward. We would like Iran to stop sponsoring terrorism, to improve human rights records, and to stop threatening Iranians who are living abroad, for example, in the EU. After the verdict was announced, ambassadors of all the countries of the EU, they were recalled from Tehran, but only after 7 months they returned, and basically nothing changed, especially in the bilateral relationship between Germany and Iran. Because Germany thought that this is a good way to proceed in politically. After all, Germany has to play some role also in the Middle East. However, and actually there was another scholar, you can see the quote below, who argued that trade is not the most important component. So yes, the trade indeed fell. It was not in the 90s, 80s, it was not as strong as before. So why would you still sustain a dialogue with such a regime? Seems to be controversial, right? So what follows now will show you an example of how this policy was actually more dangerous. So it seems to be a good thing to do, to still try to engage. But unfortunately, in when we talk about the proliferation, Germany was not a perfect player. Iran was developing a nuclear program since quite some time. Initially, it was in the framework of the US program of Atoms for Peace. But then, of course, it all ended with the revolution. And then gradually it was revealed that Iran is signing different acts on China, Argentina. Later, it was also with Russia to construct some atomic power plants. And okay, let us see what happened next. What you have to understand, the JCPOA, the pact that was signed in 2015, that is now being threatened because the US withdrew. So this is the last achievement. But Germany, what was happening in Germany in terms of nuclear development? Of course, nobody wanted Germany to go nuclear after the war. But actually, the German government, it came to me as a great surprise. They wanted to get atomic weapons. Can you imagine? Right after the war, they did everything to develop their own weapons. Of course, the people did not want that. You see on the picture people with the flags that say no to nuclear energy. And later on, this movement grew into what we know today as the Green political party, Die Grünen. And in 1969, the non-proliferation treaty was signed in Germany initially. Not everyone, even Konrad Adenauer, who was the chancellor, opposed this idea. What is special about this non-proliferation treaty is the treaty that has more. Do you have a question? This is the treaty that has more signatories than virtually any other treaty. Can you imagine? It has almost every state, almost all the states belong as signatories to this treaty. But some are not. So interestingly, Pakistan and India stand out. They're not party to the treaty. Basically, the treaty has three pillars. Nuclear to gradual disarmament, to giving up those nuclear weapons. And then the third pillar is about sharing for nuclear energy for peace. But of course, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to control how this nuclear energy is shared. And Germany was not an exemplary state in this regard because it wanted at all costs to protect its economic interests, also in the nuclear industry. So the idea was that, okay, we're not going nuclear anymore, but we are going to export the technology that we have. And when the International Atomic Energy was established, Germany was the state because, of course, they wanted to make sure that weapon state also restrict themselves, right? So why, as a state that does not have any nuclear weapon, you have to, be restricted by all sorts of provisions? But the other state, like the US, like France, like the UK, they do have those weapons. They are not restricted. No, Germany was not happy about that. But what happened is that this agency was very weak. It could not really oversee or check anything. So, for example, the Iraqi biological or program was not discovered, was not allowed to be overseen simply because the agency did not have the ability, did not have a mandate to go into such deep kind of checks. And so basically, yes, Germany followed the word of the NPT, and even joined the nuclear suppliers group later that would control to what states, under what conditions you can procure nuclear technology. But in the late 90s, it was found that actually many German companies transferred nuclear technology to the states that did not really have weapons. And this was a direct breach of the treaty. And also, actually, some companies, they did it on purpose. They knew that they sell the items that are going to be used to produce those weapons, but they still did it because the state did not have any competence to oversee, to check what's going on. And it turned out that procured technology and various manufactured details to many other states. As you see, for example, on this scheme, it went to Pakistan, it went to Argentina, to Iraq. Actually, to Iraq, this is just the worst maybe example of all, because around 150 German companies supported the production of that. Can you imagine, of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Suddenly, of course, it was not suddenly at all, because, for example, when the Argentinian nuclear program was concerned, Jimmy Carter, the president of the US, he got involved himself. So he was talking to Germany to talk them out of selling anything nuclear to Argentina. Eventually, this program was dismantled, given up. But can you imagine how did the US look at German behavior at that time? But then in 1989, Germany changed safeguards I put into law, changed in health, so applied some provisions, and Germany worked towards setting up a joint export control, which turned around basically. Yeah. When it comes to the agency, Germany was the country that pioneered all kinds of additional controls. And so from that point on, no more voices for obtaining a German domestic deterrent were heard. But as you can see, for example, in this picture, of course, Germany has nuclear weapons stationed on its territory. These are the nuclear weapons of the United States that are being shared, under the NATO agreement, that are being shared. So in case something happens, they can theoretically, hypothetically be used, which is a matter of concern too. Not everyone in Germany is particularly happy about that. So for example, this map, it shows you in different colors the attitudes of the population towards the fact that they are having nuclear weapons on their territory. So Germany, this light blue color, they have conflicted views. So on the one hand, they do see some positive things, but also some negative things too. So for example, what other? You have true believers. These are the dark blue. Poland, of course, Poland. But Russia criticizes the US because this can also be regarded as a breach of the non-proliferation treaty. You're not supposed to share. So let us pass to my final piece here. What is the difference between German and American approach? The difference, as you see, Germany had quite a different path, right? So US cut diplomatic ties with Iran in 1979, no diplomatic exchange. I mean, of course, there was always something happening, but it was all not on the top level, not on the regular level of diplomatic exchange. Whereas Germany, the, how do you call this? Bundesnah, serves the intelligence agency. They knew what was happening in Iran, but they saw it through the prism of security concerns. So they see Iran as having a defensive stance. They develop chemical weapons. Iran had a chemical weapons program. When Saddam Hussein was deposed, the development of chemical weapons in Iran subsided. It was not. It was negligible. There was nothing happening. The same thing about the Israel and the U.S. So, of course, we know that Israel has a policy of non-disclosure. So they don't state explicitly that they do have nuclear weapons, but neither do they deny. But of course, everybody understands that Israel has nuclear weapons. And then you have the U.S. and Iran feels insecure, especially because we know that the United States can try to perform to station a regime change. They don't want to see that happening in the country. No trust at all. So basically, Germany understands that there are so many psychological kind of insecurities, so many issues, so many offenses that Iran still remembers. Whereas state that is very hostile to the US is a rogue state, a bad state. We cannot talk to them. No diplomacy or deterrence containment will work. The only thing we can do, we can exert pressure. Yeah, it doesn't matter why the state wants to obtain those weapons. Maybe it feels insecure. Maybe it wants to defend itself. It doesn't matter. Of course, if they start doing that, this will become a great threat to our national security. So we have to just stop it at the very root. Hence, all of the sanctions, etc. For Germany, as we discussed already, economics is not a good tool. Economic sanctions, they are not working because you have to stay in communication. And this kind of pressure, the Germans, they don't believe it is going to work. And for them, proliferation is bad regardless of the nature of the state. It's always bad. Is it like a democracy? Is it not a democracy? Doesn't matter. And of course, Germany, they don't say it, but they criticize the fact that basically the US says nothing against Israel possessing nuclear weapons or against India and Pakistan possessing those weapons. Because it's a precedent. If they can acquire, that maybe someone else, some other states will want to acquire. Like what we saw, for example, with North Korea. North Korea even withdrew from the NPT. It's something unbelievable, but that happened. So basically, German approach is much more nuanced. They don't believe that you have to prevent forcefully. They look at how much time is needed in case they actually feel like it needs intervention. They're not rushing, like what the Americans did in Iraq. And Germany, yes. So basically, they understand that because the West, when the USSR, disintegrated, the West became the only, dominant bloc, dominant force. And of course, nobody wants to live in unipolar system. Everybody feels threatened that their cultural values, their statehood will be questioned. So of course, you have to acknowledge the fact that people have insecurities. They want to defend themselves. From here, I'm going to ask Artem to continue.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madina, for your interesting presentation. May I start? Well, yeah, actually, I'm very glad to be part of this. I'm very glad to be part of this talk, and well, I'll try to be concise, but we are going to address a very interesting topic, that is how German foreign policy is formed and what factors influence German foreign policies. Well, first of all, when we talk about Germans, we frequently refer to Europe, and when we talk about Europe, we frequently refer to Germany. This actually means that the influence of German foreign policies on the policies conducted in Brussels is enormous. And we always have to take into account this factor when analyzing the German approach towards any country in the world. So basically, we should single out two facts. First of all, Germany has really struggled to reconcile its own interests with the interests of the European Union, because they were different. Well, we do know that German companies are interested in maintaining trade relations with countries all over the world, and when policymakers in Brussels say that some country violates human rights, that some country does not value democratic principles, German companies do not really understand this logic, because they're interested in trade, they're interested maintaining stable relations. And that is why it has been really difficult to reconcile this special way, this way of maintaining good relations with any country of the world, with the European Common Foreign and Security Policy. And that is why actually the German policy towards Russia, China, Iran, and some other states has really departed policies of the European Union. And we have seen this in many different cases. We all know the case of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was to a large extent condemned by European countries, and this project was anyway promoted by Germany, and we know that it would have been implemented fully if the United States of America had not imposed this these sanctions in December 2019. And we know that the German foreign policy towards Iran has really relied on the trade situation in bilateral relations. Well, first of all, we see that Germany has always been one of the most significant trade partners of Iran. Well, in 1933, Germany was Iran's fourth largest trading partner. Later, Germany became the first largest trading partner. And this is really important because we see that in such a situation, it is very difficult to stick to policies that would contradict the interests of German companies. And even in the 2000s, Germany supplied, a large portion of Iran's import from Europe. And this is a fact that we cannot neglect. And we know that more than 1,000 of German companies worked in Iran at this time. Another important fact is that, it has anyway been mentioned, but Iran is a major source of energy resources, and Germany has struggled to diversify its supply of energy, and we know that all these projects supported by the German government, such as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, they aim to improve the situation in Germany to decrease its dependence on particular countries. And Iran has been another important actor that could be used by Germany to decrease its reliance, for instance, on Russian gas, on Russian oil. And that is why Germany could not be as assertive as the United States as far as its policy on Iran is concerned. And even today, we see that German companies account for a really large portion of the total investments made by European countries in Iran. Well, this means that the German policy towards Iran does depart from the European policy. And this is a factor that does influence the common European approach to Iran. Well, and this brings us to a very important conclusion. We have seen and proved that German businesses may have a substantial impact on the national foreign policy. So the Federal Foreign Office of Germany simply cannot ignore the interests of businesses. This actually translates into a more interesting statement. Well, we see that if German businesses exert this great influence on the country's foreign policy, this actually means that as Germany is an important actor in the European Union, the most influential actor in the European Union, this means that German businesses, to a large extent, determine European foreign policies. German business interests really frequently hamper the attempts to reach European consensus on foreign policy issues. I have already provided these examples, such as Russia, China, Iran, and it is highly likely that new examples will follow because we see that Germany is not ready to comply with this assertive approach of promoting democracy, of introducing sanctions on every case. And we also have some particular examples of how German businesses have been able to affect the national policy on Iran and also on the whole Middle Eastern region. Well, there is the Near and Middle East German Association, It is a very important actor in Germany, and it has played a crucial role in shaping German policy towards Iran and other countries of the region. It is simply very important to understand that the national policy on Iran is not fully shaped by the Federal Foreign Office. There are very many other actors, and maybe we have also left out some other important actors, but these are some of the actors that do determine German policies towards this particular country and towards other regional and global players. Thank you.
I would like to thank both of our speakers. Sorry. It was a very wonderful session, and now both the speakers are open for the questions. If anybody has some question, you are free to pose it either in the chat or you can unmute yourself and pose the question.
Commentary. It does not need to be a question. All sorts of remarks are welcome. Okay. I think that our guests, our audience does not have any questions. I think the session. Okay, everyone. It will be made available, as well as hopefully the recording of this session altogether. So please stay tuned, stay with us. Feel free to always engage with us in any forum you would be interested in. And thank you. Goodbye.